Greetings all, and welcome to Lucas Brews. In today's video we'll be continuing our exploration of 1/72nd scale Bf109s. This time it'll be a build and final review of the Revell 109 G-10, and I've previously done an inbox review of this kit, so go check that one out if you are interested. But for now, let's get into some building. To start with, I give all the parts a wash in some warm soapy water to help remove any residue and oils from the moulding process and thus help the paint and glue stick to the model, and then I begin to cut out the parts needed for the cockpit, including the fuselage halves, using my side cutters. Many of the parts in this kit had a lot of flash, so once removed from the sprue I would use my Stanley knife or some sandpaper to carefully scrape away any excess sprue and remove any flashing from unwanted areas. Around the cockpit area of the fuselage halves had particularly bad flashing, as well as some pretty large seam lines. It is definitely not the best mould, so it does require a bit of extra time to clean things up. I cut out the exhausts and used a needle to add the required hole on the engine cowling before then beginning to assemble the cockpit. The cockpit has some decent detailing, including moulded sidewall detail, floor detail, and also a joystick. There's also a seat which is basic but reasonably accurate for a 109. I continue to cut away more flash around the fuselage halves, and at this stage I also glued in the exhausts. I painted the cockpit floor and instrument panel, which I kept on a piece of sprue to use as a handle, and the fuselage half sidewalls with a thin coat of watered down Tamiya XF53 German grey, as this seemed more accurate for some of the later war 109 cockpits. After the second coat of German grey, I then began to paint the finer details in the cockpit. I used a fine brush to apply Vallejo Deep Sky Blue to paint the raised oxygen system, Vallejo Flat Yellow for the fuel line, some engine controls, and a few dials on the instrument panel, Vermillion Red for much the same purpose, Vallejo Silver for extra switches and piping, and finally some flat black for the gun sight and dials on the instrument panel. Once these were dry, I painted the cushion and gun sight XF52 Flat Earth and did a few touch-ups on the fuel line with both the flat yellow and silver. Vallejo Flat White was dry brushed onto the raised instrument dials to add some markings to them, and once this was done I got out some XF16 Flat Aluminium and used it to dry brush some metal chipping and scratching on the seat and other raised areas around the cockpit. The cockpit then received a black enamel panel wash using Tamiya Black Panel Liner Scent to help highlight details and give it a more weathered appearance. I let the enamel wash dry, and in the meantime I cut out the wing halves and the two wing bulges for the late variant of 109. The bulges were not very well moulded or shaped, and there was a lot of flash on them, as well as the sprue attachment points were very tricky to remove. I used a needle to drill holes out in the upper wings for the bulges to fit into, and then I glued them into place, followed by the wing halves. Remarkably, the bulges and wing halves actually fitted together quite nicely, and some of the bulldog clips were used to hold them together while they dried. I then used some enamel thinners on a cotton tip to rub away some of the excess black panel liner. Finally, I dabbed some Vallejo gloss varnish onto the dials on the instrument panel to give the impression of glass being over the top of the dials. I then trimmed away the extra parts on the main instrument panel, and after scratching away some paint from a few spots, I glued the instrument panel and the cockpit to the left fuselage half. They fitted pretty poorly, but once the second fuselage half was joined, I was able to more snugly fit the cockpit in since the floor area was a bit tighter. I used some masking tape to hold the fuselage halves as they dried, and added some extra glue for the cockpit floor before I then glued the wings to the fuselage. There were a few gaps between the wings and the fuselage, especially on the upper surface, but nothing too major. The landing gear was next, and unfortunately, though it fits alright, the legs for the gear are incredibly thin and fragile, so I would recommend not gluing them on until you've finished painting, and keep them separate, seeing as I managed to break them off several times. The fairings were glued to the struts, which only made them a tiny bit stronger, and then I cut out and attached the horizontal stabilizers and the supercharger air intake, which both fitted just fine. The rudder was then added and could be posed if one wished, although I kept mine nice and straight. I added some more glue to try and fill in the seam line on the underside of the fuselage, and also glued the tail wheel in at the same time. Once the landing gear legs were feeling a little bit more solid, or at least as solid as they could be, I cut out the wheels, cleaned them up with a knife, and then glued them to the struts, taking care to not damage the small pins that they fit into. Satisfied that the fuselage was now solid, I removed the masking tape and began to cut out and clean up the propeller parts. The blades suffered very badly from flashing, and I also had to use a rotary tool to drill out the hole for them to fit to the fuselage pin width. I also think that the propeller blades included in this kit are a little bit misshaped and too small for the 109. Once the propeller was in place, I then glued into place the retaining circle to the pin sticking out of the fuselage, taking care to glue it so that the prop could still spin freely. Fortunately, this was relatively easy to do on this kit. Finally, the spinner fairing was then glued into place, and I added the underside air intakes to the engine cowling. And after that, it was time for some sanding and filling. Overall, the fit of the model wasn't as bad as I was expecting after my inbox review, but it still needed some putty to fill in the gaps, especially along the fuselage halves and where the wings and fuselage meet. Once the putty had dried, I then used a nail file and some gradually softer grades of sandpaper to sand away any excess putty and also some more of the seam lines. I also had to use a knife to cut away a bit of flashing that was inside of the radiators. Some of the panel lines around the fuselage were a bit soft to begin with, and others were lost a bit due to sanding, so I used some masking tape to make a guide in some places, and then carefully used my Tamiya panel scriber to rescore some of the lost panel lines. The supercharger air intake was a solid piece of plastic, which didn't look very good, so I decided to improve it by drilling it out with a rotary tool. Once I then filled in the hole I accidentally made with some putty, it was then time for some painting. I decided to go with the aircraft featured on the box, which is White 4 from JG7 in late 1944. The box art features very dark browns and greens on the aircraft, and the instructions called for the late war German scheme of RLM 81 and 82 with RLM 76 on the undersides. Being a late war scheme, it appeared at a time where the Germans' priority was not necessarily focused on getting their paints to a consistent standard, so over the years, many photos, publications and restorations of German aircraft in the scheme have been quite widely varied in their colouring, and most model paint manufacturers even offer several variations for each colour. Normally I would use AK Interactive paints for German RLM colours since I like their quality and I think they're pretty accurate. However, at this time I did not have any of the later 81 or 82 colours, though I have ordered some for future builds. I did however still have some AK Interactive RLM 76, and since it was the lightest colour, I began by painting 4 layers of it. When brush painting, it's important to keep the layers nice and thin, using a bit of water to thin the acrylic paints, and then building them up with several almost transparent coats to avoid brush strokes and accidentally filling in recessed details. It's also a good idea to try and paint in one direction as much as possible. I normally try to paint from the front of the aircraft towards the back rather than from a side-to-side motion. Considering I didn't have RLM 81 or 82 in my AK paint range, as I mentioned, and that there was quite a wide variety of shades, I decided to instead experiment with some Tamiya XF58 Olive Green and Vallejo Chocolate Brown as alternatives. I applied a coat of the lightest of these two colours first, which was XF58 Olive Green. I used the same brushing techniques to build up 3 layers of the olive green, with each layer gradually becoming more solid and uniform on the upper surfaces, before I then squeezed out some Vallejo Chocolate Brown and began to apply a thin coat of it. This time, rather than painting the whole upper surface, I apply it in the shapes of the camouflage pattern, carefully applying the outlines of each shape and then filling them in. I keep the brown nice and thin, doing 2 coats, and given that it's a much darker colour, it needs less layers than the paler blue of RLM 76 or olive green. Once the second coat had been applied, I then do a 4th layer of olive green, this time carefully following the edges of the brown camo pattern and also neatening up any mistakes I made with the chocolate brown. I also begin to create the modelling effect at this stage on the fuselage and the tail. I do this by applying thin dabs and random small shapes of the olive green first, and then after a 3rd coat of the chocolate brown on the camouflage pattern, I do the same technique with it to make the second colour of mottling. Late in the war, some Bf109s would receive spare parts from other aircraft, even sometimes in the factory, and this would often have a different camouflage pattern. I decided to create this effect subtly by applying some AK Interactive RLM 74 and 75, which was the standard earlier colours for German fighters, so that it looked like the rudder was from a different aircraft. Once I'd applied the 4 different colours of Motteling, I then apply a thin coat of RLM 76, which was the base colour, over the top of them to soften the effect, giving it an almost airbrushed and faded appearance. I then give the RLM 76 a chance to dry and begin to paint a 5th layer to further neaten the olive green. I then paint the spinner, prop blades, front cowling and the wheels with some Vallejo flat black. I felt like the modelling was still a bit too soft, and I also wanted to match the box art, which had some larger areas of modelling, so I repeated the process of dabbing on the 4 different colours, this time trying to create a base of modelling that was a little bit larger. Once again, I then applied RLM 76 over the top, and with the second round of modelling and softening done, I was much happier with the effect I had. I added another coat of Vallejo flat black on the propeller areas and the tyres, and then continued with the aircraft's unit markings, which included painting a coat of Vallejo flat yellow on the underside of the wings, and Vallejo Vermillion red for the first colour on the fuselage band, and on all of the small control surface tabs. For the second colour on the fuselage band, I used a thin coat of Tamiya XF8 flat blue. Although decals were included for the fuselage band and also the spinner, I find it a bit easier to paint these things. As for the spinner on the front of the aircraft, I used a little bit of Vallejo flat white and a very fine brush to carefully paint the outline of the spiral. I added another coat of flat yellow on the wings and added a bit more detail around the landing gear, including painting the interior of the wheel wells with XF24 dark grey, the hub for the main wheels with Tamiya X1 gloss black, and the landing gear struts with XF16 flat aluminium. After a final coat of black on the tyres, I then decided to add the decals. The decals in this kit were really excellent both in terms of their detail and also their quality. After being soaked in some warm water, they slid perfectly off the transfer paper and onto the model without folding, tearing or disintegrating, which I was very happy with. They also seemed quite nice and thin and were very easy to move around. Once all the decals were in position, I then used a cotton bud to dab some Vallejo decal softener over the top of them to make them a little bit softer and help them show surface detail underneath. Then I added some Tamiya decal adhesive over the top, which would help fix them down to the surface of the model. I left the decals overnight to dry, and then using a brush I applied a coat of Vallejo's water-based matte varnish. This protects the decals and also blends the surface of the decals and the paint together, making the decals look more like they had been painted on along with the camouflage. Next, it was time for some weathering. I started with the usual metal chipping with a small brush and some Tamiya XF16, which was dabbed into areas where paint scratches are likely to occur. These included the leading edges of the wings, the horizontal stabilizers, around the radiator and air intakes, and also the tail, which are exposed to air resistance and particles that might happen to be in the aircraft's way. The edges of the prop blades also received some for much the same reason, and I added further chipping around moving parts such as the control surfaces and undercarriage, and finally the places where the crew are likely to walk, such as along the wings, and along the lines of hatches and access points the crew are likely to use, and could accidentally scratch paint away from them over time. I give the metal chipping a few hours to dry, and in the meantime apply some Tamiya X31 titanium gold onto the exhaust pipes. I then turned my attention to the canopy, and also the small fragile antennas and parts that I'd left off the aircraft so I wouldn't damage them when painting. The canopy was cut out, and then I carefully painted the frame with some Vallejo German grey and a fine brush. The dark grey acts as the interior colour since the canopy plastic is obviously see-through. Once the German grey had dried, I then carefully scratched away any mistakes and excess paint off with a cocktail stick. I then glued the antenna to the canopy, along with the pitot tube, control balancers and various other small antennas to the main aircraft. The canopy and its antenna were then painted in 2 coats of chocolate brown, while the antennas on the aircraft were painted in various colours to match their locations, including RLM 76 on the underside and chocolate brown mainly on the upper surface. Once a 3rd coat of chocolate brown was painted onto the canopy, I again used a cocktail stick to scratch off any excess paint, and then it was ready to be stuck onto the model. Before that was done, however, I used some Tamiya panel liner to darken the exhausts and to create some dark lines streaking back from the control surfaces, access hatches, landing gear and the radiators to give a dirty and grimy streaking effect. I then thinned down the effect with some enamel thinners and used some black and rust coloured Tamiya weathering master pigments to create a weathered effect on the exhausts, and then a bit of black was used for the gun smoke and exhaust soot streaks. Some rust and black was used to add some extra leaks coming from behind the radiators and on the underside of the aircraft, and I used a little bit of black to add some grease marks coming back from the control surface hinges. And once the weathering was done, I added the ill-fitting canopy onto the aircraft, and with that, the Revell 1/72nd scale Bf109 G-10 was complete. And here you can see the finished kit. I'm quite pleased with the results I got, and though I'm sure a more experienced modeler could probably spend a lot more time and replace a few parts to get an even better result with this kit, it turned out a lot better than I expected after doing my inbox a while back. Although I don't mind the darker green and brown I used for RLM 81 and 82, I very much look forward to trying out the AK paints I've ordered and seeing how they compare. This kit has its fair share of problems, including some pretty poor fitting parts, some lackluster or even out of scale details, and it takes a fair bit of sanding and cutting to remove the seam lines and flashing, as it is not a cleanly moulded kit at all. Compared to previous kits I've looked at, it certainly isn't as easy to build as, say, the Academy or Italeri 109, which have a pretty similar level of detail. At least it's a bit more detailed and still somehow cheaper than the Airfix 109G kit, though definitely not as easy fitting and cleanly moulded for sure. And it is certainly nowhere near as good as Zvezda's 109F, which is actually the same tool Revell used for their 109F in 1/72nd scale according to ScaleMates. Now obviously those kits are all subtly different compared to this later and more bulgy looking high altitude G10, so if you're after this specific variant of the 109, then unfortunately this kit or a more expensive but also much more detailed AZ model kit are, I believe, your only options at this point, at least in 72nd scale. I paid $25 AUD for this kit at an air show. Ironically, I got it from a Hunter Valley fighter collection stand where they were raising money to restore a Spitfire, which was X4009, the one flown by the top Australian ace during the Battle of Britain, Pat Hughes. But anyways, as for buying this kit elsewhere in Australia, the price is normally around about 22 to 26 AUD, which is a bit up there for an old and low quality tool in my opinion. I probably won't be doing this kit again, as nice as the decals were, everything else is a bit mediocre. But not to fear, I will continue the exploration of more 109Fs and Gs in 1/72nd scale. The next 109 build video is going to either be the Tamiya or AZ model kit, depending on which I finish first, and as you will no doubt see, they are much better tooled than this one. Thank you very much for watching this video. I do hope you enjoyed it and got something out of it. If you did, please be sure to leave a like and also subscribe to the channel. And feel free to leave any suggestions for how I can improve and any questions in the comment section down below. A big shout out, as always, to my wonderful patrons for helping me fund buying these kits and the supplies I use to build them. This channel wouldn't be possible, or at least it wouldn't have grown this much without all of you guys, so thanks so much. Keep your eyes out. We'll be doing some more BF109s. I've got some here to build, and as you'll see, one here to do an inbox review on soon. So stay tuned for all of those, plenty of other kits as well, and I'm still working on some animations. I'd like to get a few smaller ones done at some point, but it's been a little bit tricky lining up getting some people to do voices, and then just finding the time and space to make them. But stay tuned for some of those, and obviously I'm still working on the big project, Milne Bay, so stay tuned for some updates on that as well. Anyways, thanks again, and until the next video, take care, and model on.